Hello and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Rhea Matthews and today we're privileged to be joined with the Hon Bob Carr, former Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs and the current Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. Thank you, Mr. Carr, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to begin by asking you what you believe are the specific opportunities for Australia and China in their relationship today.
I think we've got to cooperate on peace and security issues, and that means a dialogue over South China Sea, for example. That's going to be high on the Australia-China agenda. But I think what's happening in North Korea means we've got to talk about Northeast Asia as well. And both sides becoming used to a deeper discussion of national security is, I think, the challenge. There's a lot of attention in China, among Chinese think tanks and Chinese media, of course, to the bilateral relationship they've got with the United States. Getting their attention to listen to an Australian perspective may, from time to time, take a bit of work.
Okay, great. In a recent piece you wrote for The Australian, you claimed that certain sections of Australian society exhibit a China panic or a Cold War mentality when it comes to China. So are you able to elaborate on this? And
sure, no, yeah, happy to. That's not true of the Australian government.
Right.
I think it's fair to say that governments of both sides have committed to working to have a robust relationship with China. It was under the Gillard Labor government when I was Foreign Minister that the Prime Minister's efforts produced a commitment to what's called a strategic partnership between Australia and China. Right. Upgraded during President Xi's visit when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister to what both sides called a comprehensive strategic partnership. In contrast to this work and the sort of work that produced the FTA, there are some Australian commentators who really want to see China through American eyes and want Australia to have a policy that's built around American concerns and American priorities. And I think there's a case for saying, look, Australia's interests may not always be the same as those of the United States when it comes to dealing with China. America, for example, wanted Australia to stay out of the Chinese-sponsored Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I tell you what, we'd look awfully stupid if we'd done that at the request of President Obama, who I think probably believes that his request was a mistake now. Canada's just applied to join, everyone except Japan's in it, and it's now issuing loans with the authority and partnership of the World Bank. I think we'd look very isolated if we'd taken the advice of two American generals and two American admirals. And indeed, there were people hostile to China in Australia, in think tanks, who wanted us to take the advice of running patrols against the Chinese in the South China Sea, up close to Chinese territory, Chinese claimed territory. Well, if we'd done that at the demand of people in Australia who've got a hostile attitude towards China, we'd be the only American friend, partner or ally doing it. It would stand out. We'd be the only ones doing this. Now, why not run a policy towards China that has the confidence to disagree with the Chinese over their assertiveness in the South China Sea, for example, and to insist there on adherence to international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but not limited to that. Why not craft a policy based on an Australian perspective, which may not always be the same, although it sometimes will be the same in respect of China, as that of the US?
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you. Turning to the South China Sea, I think you'd agree the situation is getting more tense by the minute, especially given China's recent rejection of the ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration on the legality of its claims in the South China Sea. Do you see any end in sight to these tensions? And specifically, what do you think the best course of action for Australia is in response to this situation?
Well, I think Australia's got to continue to do what it's done under both governments.
Sure.
Indeed, what it did when I was Foreign Minister talking for Australia. One, say that international law prevails. That's a disagreement we've got with the Chinese, who say that their ownership of these territories predates the international law. Yeah. So I think Australia should continue to say we believe in adherence to law. Second, I think Australia's got to say we don't want any preemptive action, and that includes militarisation to take place. So we're asking for a cooling of tensions. And third, I think we've got to continue to explore the opportunities of not only managing the dispute better, but moving towards resolution of the dispute, which can only involve a commitment to resource sharing. Okay. And it would be a great win if we could help persuade, along with other nations, both sides, to commit to setting aside the arguments over sovereignty and develop resources, splitting the proceeds. Okay. Resource sharing agreements, yes, I think, is the best approach to a long-term solution. Sure. But sadly, we seem a long way from that. Okay. But certainly, I would argue against Australia taking the advice of US admirals and going off and running patrols that copy those of the Americans. That would, as the federal government has said, that would exacerbate tensions. Right. It would exacerbate tensions. And I think the Turnbull government is quite right to say that.
Okay, great. So turning away from our region a bit, during your time as Foreign Minister, you were quite vocal about the situation in Syria and in the Middle East in general. As the situation stands now, do you think Australia can play any meaningful role in managing the conflicts in the Middle East?
Very hard in Syria. Right. And Australia should welcome the agreement by the United States and Russia, the Russian Federation, to end the conflict and get a power sharing agreement. There's been considerable movement on America's part. I remember a couple of years ago, indeed when I was Foreign Minister, when the American position was Assad must go at all costs. Now the greater risk of ISIS has reared its threatening head, and America's got to deal with that. So there has been movement in the American position. I've got to say the Russians probably think that they've been vindicated throughout this. But it is the problem from hell, largely because you've got competing militia. I was hoping to get to promote the idea of a medical pact to get medicines into the country, but dealing with competing militia, so many competing sides to this made it hard to get an agreement to protect the doctors and nurses and the flow of medicines that I would have liked. When it comes to other matters in the Middle East, I think Australia should be sending a strong message to the Israelis that spreading settlements on Palestinian land, as they're continuing to do, only makes the establishment of a Palestinian state in the context of an agreement between Israel and Palestine all the harder. And why Australia's given up saying that, I just find very hard to understand. We ought to be saying there must be a two-state solution. The present Israeli cabinet, of course, is opposed to that. Over 60% of them are on record opposing a two-state solution. And Prime Minister Netanyahu said there'll never be one on his watch. Well, that's just a disaster because it leaves a majority Jewish and Israeli rule over a majority Arab, Islamic and Christian population on the West Bank. And that is just a disaster. And the world will respond ultimately to the West Bank being absorbed in bits and pieces through the spread of settlements into Israeli sovereignty.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So I want to thank you once again, Mr. Carr, for taking the time to speak with us. You provided some very interesting insights, no doubt gained from your very public life in the Australian political scene. So thank you so much for that. And for more information and high-quality analysis on international issues, please visit our website at www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.